The bouquet of lilies arrived at Zynab's office exactly at 10 a.m., just as they had every Tuesday for the last 3 months. "To my future, the woman who completes me," the card read in elegant, looping script. Zynab's colleagues cooed with envy. "Zynab, where did you find this David? He's a godsend. He knows your favorite flowers, your favorite coffee, and he even knew you had a headache yesterday before you posted it." Zynab smiled, though a tiny, cold shiver traced its way down her spine. At 28, she felt she had finally hit the jackpot. David was a successful architect, charming, attentive, and seemingly obsessed with her in the most romantic way possible. He had appeared in her life like a miracle just after a messy breakup, bumping into her at a quiet art gallery in Abuja. He had known exactly what to say to make her feel seen. But as the wedding day approached, the perfect romance began to feel like a perfectly constructed cage. It started with the coincidences. Zynab would mention an old school friend she hadn't seen in years, and 2 days later, David would accidentally find that friend's social media profile and suggest they don't reconnect because the friend seemed toxic. He knew her passwords. For safety, he had installed a GPS app on her phone, so he could pick her up if she got stranded, and he always seemed to show up exactly where she was, even when she hadn't told him her plans. "It's just because he loves you so much," Z, her best friend, Halima, reassured her. "In a world of ghosting and players, a man who wants to know where you are 24/7 is a blessing. Don't overthink it." Zynab pushed her doubts aside. On a breezy Saturday at the Abuja National Mosque, they were married in a ceremony that looked like a fairy tale. David looked at her with an intensity that felt like fire. "Now," he whispered as they danced their first dance, "you are finally exactly where you belong. You will never have to look at another person again. I am your world now." It was a beautiful sentiment, but the way he said "exactly where you belong" didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a verdict. Zynab didn't realize that the man she had just sworn her life to hadn't fallen in love with her at an art gallery by chance. He had been curating her life for a year before they ever met. She hadn't married a husband, she had married a predator who had turned stalking into a fine art. The honeymoon in Zanzibar was supposed to be a dream, but for Zynab, it felt like a high-security lockdown. David had booked a private villa so secluded that they didn't see another soul for a week. Whenever Zynab tried to strike up a conversation with the hotel staff or other tourists, David would suddenly appear, his hand tightening around her waist. "Why are you talking to strangers, Z? You have me. Isn't my company enough?" When they returned to their new home in Abuja, the hidden truth began to manifest in physical barriers. David had installed a state-of-the-art security system with cameras in every room, including the kitchen and the hallways. "For your protection, sweetheart," he said, tapping his tablet. "Abuja isn't as safe as it used to be. I want to be able to see that you're okay even when I'm at the office." Zynab felt the walls closing in. She decided to do some spring cleaning while David was at a site visit, hoping to reclaim some sense of agency in her own house. She found herself in the attic, moving boxes of David's old architectural blueprints. In the corner, tucked behind a false wall in a cedar chest, she found a leather-bound scrapbook. Her breath caught in her throat. The book wasn't filled with architectural designs. It was filled with her. There were photos of her from 2 years ago, long before they met at the art gallery. There were printed logs of her old Twitter posts, receipts from cafes she used to frequent, and even a discarded grocery list she had written months before David entered her life. Most terrifying of all was a detailed map of her old apartment building with her daily route highlighted in red ink. The perfect romance was a lie. David hadn't bumped into her by accident, he had positioned himself in her path after months of meticulous surveillance. He had studied her likes, her fears, and her heartbreaks to create a David that was the perfect antidote to her loneliness. He hadn't fallen in love with Zynab, he had haunted her. As she turned the final page, she found a list of names. Halima, her boss, her brother, each name had a red X through it. Underneath, David had written, "Obstacles removed. Phase 3 complete. She is isolated. She is mine." Zynab heard the heavy clunk of the front door downstairs. The security system beeped, announcing David's return. "Z. Where are you, my love?" His voice echoed through the house, sounding unerringly calm. Zynab realized with a jolt of pure terror that the cameras in the attic were live. He knew exactly what she was holding. He knew she had found the terrifying truth. She looked at the small attic window, then at the stairs. There was no way out. The man who had promised to be her ward was now her warden, and the house she thought was a sanctuary was actually a cage designed by a master architect. Zynab's heart thundered against her ribs, the sound so loud she feared the microphones in the attic would pick it up. She slammed the scrapbook shut and shoved it back into the cedar chest, but it was too late. The heavy thud of David's footsteps on the wooden stairs was rhythmic, deliberate, the sound of a hunter who no longer needs to hide. "You weren't supposed to be up here, Z," David said, his head appearing above the floor line. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even frowning. He had that same perfect smile, but his eyes were as flat and cold as a serpent's. "I told you the attic was dusty and bad for your allergies. I was only trying to protect you." Zynab stood her ground, though her legs felt like water. "Protect me from what, David? From the truth? I saw the book. You've been following me for years. Our chance meeting was a setup. Everything about us is a lie." David stepped into the room, closing the attic door behind him. The space suddenly felt microscopic. "A lie? No, Z. It's a masterpiece," he said, tilting his head. "Most men leave love to chance. I left nothing to chance. I studied you because I knew you were the only one worthy of my devotion. I removed the people who didn't appreciate you, the friends who drained your energy, the brother who always asked for money. I cleared the weeds so our love could grow." This is the chilling logic of a fixated stalker. In their mind, stalking isn't a crime, it's dedication. By the time the victim realizes the intensity of the attention, they are often already socially and emotionally isolated. David had used love bombing, an overwhelming display of affection and attention, to bypass Zynab's natural defenses. Now that the hook was set, the mask was no longer necessary. "You're sick, David. You need help," Zynab whispered, backing toward the small window. "I'm the only one who truly knows you, Z," he countered, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating bass. "And because I know you aren't going anywhere. Think about it. Your phone is in my name. Your car has a kill switch I control. Your family thinks I'm a saint and you're mentally fragile. Who would they believe?" He walked toward her, and for the first time, Zynab saw the perfect architect, for what he really was, a man who built structures to keep things in, not to let them breathe. He reached out to touch her face, and Zynab flinched. The rejection made his smile flicker and die. "Don't do that," he warned, his grip suddenly tightening on her arm. "I've spent too much time and money on this romance for you to ruin it now. We are going to go downstairs, we are going to have dinner, and you are going to forget you ever saw this room. If you don't." He trailed off, looking at the map with the red X through her brother's name. The threat was silent, but it was deafening. The suspension of her reality was complete. Zynab realized she was no longer a wife, she was a captive in a high-tech fortress. She had to play along to survive, but her mind was already searching for the one thing David couldn't architect, a way out that he hadn't anticipated. Zynab allowed herself to be led downstairs, her body moving with the stiff compliance of a mannequin. She sat at the dining table while David meticulously plated a meal of grilled salmon and asparagus, her favorite, of course. Every clink of his fork against the plate felt like a countdown. He talked about their future, about building a vacation home in the hills of Jos, or while monitoring 3 different security feeds on his tablet propped up against the wine carafe. You see, Z. Everything is better when we're in sync, he said, taking a sip of wine. Zynab realized that David's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, his obsession with data. He relied entirely on his cameras and GPS trackers to tell him if she was safe. If she could provide the data he expected while her physical self did something else, she might have a chance. She needed to exploit a blind spot in his meticulously designed architecture. The next morning, Zynab began her rehabilitation. She acted the part of the repentant wife, apologizing for her outburst in the attic and leaning into David's affection. She watched him closely as he entered the security codes into the main hub near the front door. He used a biometric lock paired with a 12-digit ruling code. It was impenetrable from the outside, but it relied on a local server in his home office. While David was in the shower, Zynab moved with lightning speed. She didn't try to leave, she knew the gates were deadbolt. Instead, she went to the kitchen and began to subtly sabotage the smart home hub. She used a small needle to pierce the casing of the router, causing it to overheat slowly. She knew David had programmed the house to fail safe. If the internal server crashed, the electronic locks would default to manual mode for fire safety. However, David's surveillance wasn't just digital, it was psychological. He returned to the room, damp from the shower, and looked at her. "You're very quiet today, Z. And your heart rate on your watch is elevated. Why are you nervous?" Zynab forced a laugh, her mind racing. "I'm just excited about the Jos house, David. I was looking at some interior colors on my tablet." She showed him a screen of paint swatches. David's eyes narrowed, searching her face for a flicker of deceit. For a moment, the air in the room was so thin it felt like they were at high altitude. "Good," he finally said, kissing her forehead. "I'm glad you're finally seeing reason. I have to go to the office for a few hours to sign some contracts. Stay inside." The perimeter alarm is set. As his car pulled out of the driveway, Zynab felt the house begin to hum. The router she had damaged was starting to smell of ozone. The perfect architect had built a cage of technology, but technology is prone to the same entropy as everything else. She had exactly 20 minutes before the system would reboot or crash. She didn't go for the front door, she went for the cedar chest in the attic. She needed the scrapbook, not for herself, but as the only evidence that could shatter David's saintly reputation in the eyes of the law. Just as she reached the attic, the lights flickered and died. The house fell into a tomb-like silence. The electronic locks clicked, the failsafe had triggered. But as she grabbed the book, her phone buzzed with a notification from the secondary, battery-powered backup system. It was a text from David. "The server just went offline, Z. Why are you in the attic again?" The hunter was already on his way back. The sound of David's tires screeching onto the gravel driveway echoed through the dead-silent house. Zynab scrambled down the attic stairs, the heavy scrapbook clutched to her chest. She had underestimated his reaction time. In David's world, a server offline wasn't a technical glitch, it was an act of war. She reached the ground floor just as David slammed his palm against the biometric scanner. It blinked red, the system was still rebooting. But David wasn't a man to be locked out of his own creation. He pulled a manual override key from his pocket, his face visible through the frosted glass of the front door. It wasn't the face of a husband, it was the face of an owner about to reclaim a straying possession. "Zynab, open this door," he roared, his voice muffled but terrifying. Zynab didn't waste time screaming. She ran to the kitchen and grabbed the heavy chef's knife, not to attack him, but to pry open the back of the smart home control panel. She needed to disable the secondary battery backup that was still feeding him her location data. With a desperate shove, she severed the wires. The small LED lights on the wall cameras finally went dark. She was now invisible, but she was still trapped. She realized that escaping through the doors was a gamble. He would be waiting there. She remembered the architectural flaw she had noticed in his perfect jaws plans. David loved aesthetics over utility. The laundry chute in the hallway led directly to the basement, which had a small, manual ventilation window at ground level, the only exit not tied to the electronic grid. As David finally turned the key and the front door swung open, Zynab dove into the laundry chute. The slide was steep and dark, smelling of detergent and fear. She landed hard on a pile of linens in the basement just as she heard David's boots hit the floorboards above her. "I know you're in here, Z," he called out, his voice unevenly smooth again. "You can't survive out there. I'm the only one who knows your passwords, your bank accounts, your medical history. I've deleted you from every system. Without me, you don't exist." This was his final psychological gambit, total identity erasure. By controlling her digital footprint, David had made her believe that she was a ghost in her own life. But Zynab held the scrapbook. In her hands was the physical proof of his crimes, the analog evidence that his digital world couldn't erase. She squeezed through the narrow basement window, the jagged metal frame tearing at her dress. She tumbled onto the damp grass behind the house, the Abuja night air hitting her lungs like a shot of adrenaline. She didn't head for the main road where he would expect her. She ran toward the thick bush at the back of the estate, heading for the one person David hadn't marked in his book because he thought she was too insignificant, the old woman who sold roasted corn at the end of the street, who had no social media, no GPS, and no digital footprint. Zynab looked back once. The house stood like a dark monolith, David's silhouette pacing past the upstairs windows. She realized that while he was a master of the perfect romance, he had forgotten one thing: a cage is only effective as long as the prisoner believes there is no outside world. Zynab reached the corn seller's shack, trembling and covered in basement dust. The old woman, Mama Busy, didn't ask for a password or a GPS coordinate. She saw a woman in flight and pulled her behind the heavy burlap sacks of charcoal. Minutes later, David's sleek SUV crawled past the store, his high-beam headlights slicing through the darkness like searchlights. He was looking for a digital trail, but Zynab was now as invisible as the shadows. With Mama Busy's help, Zynab reached the police headquarters the following morning. When she laid the scrapbook on the inspector's desk, the atmosphere in the room changed. It wasn't just a domestic dispute anymore. The book contained photos of Zynab taken from high-angle lenses, copies of her private medical records, and most damning of all, a detailed plan to re-educate her in the Joss house. The investigation revealed that David wasn't just an architect, he was a disgraced former security contractor who had used his knowledge of surveillance to curate 3 previous perfect marriages. Each wife had eventually disappeared from social circles, moved abroad, or suffered mental breakdowns that left David in control of their assets. Zynab hadn't just married a stalker, she had married a serial predator who used marriage as a legal cover for kidnapping. The educational lesson of this story is a chilling reminder: extreme attentiveness is not always a sign of love, it can be a sign of surveillance. Love bombing, the overwhelming bombardment of affection, gifts, and soulmate rhetoric, is often the first phase of predatory grooming. A partner who demands your passwords, monitors your location for safety, and systematically removes toxic people from your life is not protecting you, they are isolating you. Zynab's recovery was long. She had to rebuild her digital identity from scratch, changing every account and living in a protected shelter for months. But she was free. David was eventually charged with stalking, kidnapping, and multiple counts of privacy violations. The perfect architect was finally confined to a structure he couldn't control, a 6-by-8-foot prison cell. True romance requires freedom, trust, and boundaries. If a relationship feels like it was written in the stars, with zero friction and uncanny coincidences, take a step back. Real love grows over time through shared experiences, not through a pre-designed script. Have you ever experienced a love bombing that felt too good to be true? What are the red flags you look for when someone seems a bit too interested in your daily routine? Share your stories of intuition and safety in the comments below to help others stay vigilant.